Stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting.
When we share stories, whether in our personal or business lives, how we share them makes a difference in how we remember them and in how we're perceived by the people we're sharing them with. When you're listening to this podcast, I encourage you to listen and consider your own related stories. To listen and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. And think about how you share those stories and the messages they carry for you and for the people who are hearing them.
I am so grateful. Tara Bradford introduced us. Samuel Cohen is our guest today on the podcast. And we started talking before I hit record, and now I'm regretting waiting to hit that button because the conversation was already becoming so rich. So I asked Alan to join me to talk about the pivot points in his life after reading through his LinkedIn profile and some of your work. And so I'm just so grateful for you to join me today. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the first question I always ask my guests in order to put some context into the later conversation that will get personal, I'm sure, because it's about stories. I always ask the guests to share something about themselves that most people might not know about them, something that might surprise people who know you now, but maybe not people who knew you as a kid. Or do you have something in mind that you could share with us?
Sure. And I'm laughing. I've had clients say to me, well, wow, you really live your life out loud. Like there's nothing that I don't share. But that's not completely true. You know, I generally share what's easy to share, not the deeper hurts and the sadnesses and the grief and all that. But so I would say the people, because I'm so very, very outgoing and high energy, I think people, even some of the people that I'm closer to would be surprised to know that I've suffered from and struggled with depression and anxiety probably all my life, but only diagnosed as depressive when I was in my mid-20s. But when I think back on my early childhood, I think anxiety and fear was very much a part of my experience, but I didn't always feel safe to share that with people, even my very loving family. Mm-hmm. So that's something that I think people would, and to this day, while it's definitely under control and manageable, I definitely go into some pretty dark phases, dark days. And I don't judge them. I'm able to move through them relatively swiftly, but I do certainly experience that. And so that's my little surprise.
It sounds like you practice mindfulness around it when you.
I do, and sometimes I'm more successful at it than other times. But I don't judge it. That's for sure. I know it's all part of my process.
Oh, I love that. And I just had a conversation about how limiting judgment can be, whether it's to yourself or to others. I mean, just moments ago, I had this conversation with somebody saying that when you approach something with judgment, whether it's approaching yourself and something you're doing with judgment, or if you're approaching somebody in front of you with any kind of judgment, there's no possible way you're going to have a positive impact.
Yeah.
You have to approach it with curiosity and compassion.
I agree. And that's also why I think that we need to talk about things like depression and anxiety, certainly in this moment in time and with social distancing and all of that. Isolation, I think it's those of us with depression and anxiety, I think it's we're like sitting targets for it. And I think lots of people are experiencing it, maybe even for the first time. But to talk about it, it takes the monster out of the attic. It shines a light on it. It makes it less scary, and you're less alone because I think people are ashamed often of it, so they don't share it, and then it gets bigger. But the truth is, most of us, even on our good days, are often experiencing elements of fear, anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one thing when you said most people probably don't know that about you. I would say that they might not know it about you, but they wouldn't be surprised by it because I think all of us, especially now, have had some experience either personally touched by it or somebody in our family, somebody that we're close with. And one of the best things about when I ask that question is you'd be surprised at how many people say, well, everybody knows I'm really outgoing, and they might be surprised to know that I'm actually more of an introvert. So I think that's beautiful. It just speaks to the complexity of our human nature and the what we choose to share and how we choose to share it.
Yeah. Well, and I think social media, where I do a lot of my business, and we were talking about that earlier, it's a wonderful place for people to showcase all the beautiful things that are going on in their life. But the sharing of the highlight reel is not the same as the behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And finding out how much, discovering how much you're comfortable sharing and putting out into the world that isn't all filtered and airbrushed, that's something that we each have to ask ourselves. And so I try to do it a little bit more now than I did before, just in service of vulnerability and being a leader. But it's still, it doesn't come naturally to me.
Alan, I love that you brought that up, because I've been thinking about that a lot, because over the last 5 years, especially about 5 years ago, when things were really all about all the good stuff. I got a new car, here are my kids, look how shiny and clean they are. And I think maybe 5 years ago it was worse, where people were really doing the highlight reel. But I'm seeing a shift. But I remember when people would say that to me 5 years ago, and I'd be like, I just don't see it that way. And I realized that the people that I connect with, that I see, have always been sharers of every aspect, the complexity. Right. And so I realized that it's my circles and not the general public or other people's experience of Facebook or LinkedIn, whatever, so different from mine.
Right. So, it's funny. I got a call from my mother the other day. I like to do like a Jewish accent. Well, my mother doesn't really have one, but it always makes the story better. It's just like on my voicemail. She's not on Facebook. She was like, "So Alan, I'm hearing that you cut off all your hair. Is that true? Is that true? Is that true? Call me. I had cut all my hair because of COVID, but my family thinks I share too much."
Oh no, that's so funny. My grandmother, my dad's side, when I moved to Montana and she was still living in Rockville, Maryland, she'd call me. And of course, I would know who it was immediately when I'd have the voice message. But she'd say, we called her Bubby Lee. Her name was Leona. And Bubby, of course, is Yiddish for grandmother. And she would say, "It's Bubby Lee calling. Sarah, it's Bubby Lee calling." Like I wouldn't know who it was.
I like Alan, it's your mother. It's like,
I do, really? I was wondering.
59 years, I know that voice.
Isn't that hilarious? Well, this is a perfect segue into what I would love to chat about today, which is that kind of what we started our conversation with before I hit record that I was so bummed I missed, which was really about our identity and how it's shaped around the stories that our family tells. And in particular, how a story that somebody shares with us can shift not only our sense of identity and purpose, but it also shifts the way that we see our role in the world around us. So you were mentioning that it was only about 10 years ago. So you were in your 40s, late 40s, that your mother and her siblings were together and talking about stories that happened when they were little. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. And it is so true that in one moment you could hear a story that really could change the trajectory of your life or your understanding or of your experience of a set of beliefs. And I was saying that my mom, who was one of 7 children, now she's the only one alive. My mom was, I think, mom will be 90. But about 10 years ago, we were gathered, and it was one of the only times I recall she being with all of her sisters who were alive at that time. It was either 3 or 4 of them. I can't remember now. But they were talking about my grandfather in Russia before he came over to the United States, and his brothers, and how one of them had been hung by his tallis, by his prayer shawl, and it was witnessed by my grandfather. I know, right? I'm shivering as I say it out loud. And and they said it in a rather matter-of-fact way. Like, clearly that story had been shared many times over among them, but I had never heard it. And in that moment, although I certainly identify as a Jew and was raised in a modern Orthodox home, and I had never felt such a strong connection to being Jewish and a connection to Holocaust survivors as I had been, even having gone to like Auschwitz and Dachau as a kid, like on a teen tour. I remember it was very, there wasn't that strong tie to it. It was a historic museum, but it wasn't like my family, my great-grandfather, great uncles, like they could have died here. Many did. Probably did. And
you didn't know that when you were there.
I didn't know that. So in that, it was that thing that happened to my people, but not to my family. And I do believe that in that moment, I felt more tied to Judaism. And there've been other moments in recent years, like the death of my in-laws and that, which have gotten me back more to it, the sense of Judaism as a part of my identity. But yeah, that story, that's thank you for letting me share that.
That's incredible. And I shared earlier that when I was a study abroad student in Australia, I was connected with a distant cousin who was an Auschwitz survivor. And I was only 19. And that's when it woke me up, even though I had studied the Holocaust at Hebrew school and Sunday school all through when I lived in Colorado Springs in LA. And I even knew survivors. The Sarah and Nate Hauptman in Colorado Springs came to my bat mitzvah, and they were dear friends of ours. And we used to deliver baked Purim goodies, which was the story of Esther for our listeners. It happens in the spring, and we would make our special cookies, the Hamantaschen cookies, and deliver them to Sarah and Nate's house. And I always loved them, but I never had connected the Holocaust directly because I knew my family had all come to the U.S. long before the actual Holocaust occurred. They had escaped pogroms for sure, but it was prior to the Holocaust. Yeah. So yeah, that story really resonated with me when you said that.
And I think in this moment of racial tension in this country, it's reawakened my connection to my past, because it's, the Holocaust, all that we went through all those years ago, in a lot of ways, in the grand scheme of things, it was not that many years ago. And, I think of that quote, which I will mangle right now, but it's like when these people were oppressed, I stood by,
right.
And
then they came for me.
Yeah. Who was there for me? And so I feel that way. I feel that way about our Black brothers and sisters. It's like we need to stand up for them and stand with them, because it could easily be us. It was us.
It has been, and it continues to be.
It has been and continues to. And so I will no longer use my own Judaism and being a gay man as it's not like I've done enough already for the cause of racism, and to address bigotry. Like there's a lot left to do for, before we are all truly treated fairly and
yes. And I think you brought up something else earlier that really resonated with me, is that we as white Jews have this luxury of fitting in when we want to. Yeah. And a person of color, they don't have that luxury.
Right. Exactly.
It's so visual and so quick.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you say that we have work to do, and it's so true. One of the things that really that changed for me was moving to Montana. So moving from Washington, D.C. to a small city in Montana where there were very few Jews, I can't even tell you how many times the strangest things were said to me when people would find out I was Jewish. Yeah. And I felt compelled to share that I was Jewish here. Like, I felt like I had to be an ambassador for my people, that I didn't want to hide behind the luxury of being white and the same as everybody else. And I had people say things like, "Oh, I love Jewish people," which
Some of my best
makes me
friends
wonder.
are Jewish.
Yeah, my best friend in high school was Jewish.
Right.
Or the whole, "Oh, there aren't any Jewish people in Helena." I'm like, well, you just met one. So
Yeah, my sister, who's a little older than I, we went to public school in Staten Island, and my sister said when she would tell people she was Jewish, that they were surprised. They thought that she should have like a horn on her head.
Right.
It's like by the time I went through high school, there were more Jewish kids, but it was very Italian, very Italian Catholic community, and with a handful of the Jewish kids. So, anyway.
So when I come back to that story of just 10 years ago or so, when you heard those stories, do you remember the first thing you did afterward? I mean, it obviously took a while for you to look back and process that experience to realize the pivotal moment for what it was. What do you think was it that made you take that step back and realize that moment?
Well, so how do I say this lovingly to my family? So we're a family of storytellers, and we're a family of talkers. And I get the gift of gab from my dad and my mom, like just no filter. Like people just talk. They talk if they're happy. They talk if they're anxious. They talk if they just talk. And so it takes a lot to get my attention at a family dinner, because there's a big family. There's so much talking. There's so much activity. You're basically just fighting your way in to make sure you get your serving of turkey. Exactly. So I don't know why, and they were telling that story and they were ready to move on to the next story. And I was like, whoa. Oh, hold on. I'm doing the T sign here. Hold on, time out. All right. And I got super curious. And my brothers and sisters, we all chimed in. We started asking more questions to pull out the story. But I think that sometimes with storytelling, people have told the story so many times that they forget the impact that the story has. Mm-hmm. But it didn't get past me. And so I think that's in this rush to get all this information out, or to just move through it. I think it's incumbent on the listener as well to say, "Oh, hold on, slow down. I want to know more about that."
Right. So I'm imagining you sitting at this giant dinner table.
Yes.
And do you remember kind of, if you put yourself back there, you remember kind of looking around and you hear the voice saying something about the talit that he was killed with. Mm-hmm. And you're creating this visual image in your head of this hanging. Mm-hmm. Do you remember the expressions on the faces of those women, the sisters and nieces of those people that were murdered?
It was like they didn't relive it. They were telling the story factually, not with the emotion. And that could be part of a survival mechanism for people who have experienced a lot of loss
and trauma,
and who that they just don't step into the feeling of it to make the story more personal. Mm-hmm. But it felt personal to me. It felt personal. It felt like I was in the movie.
Yeah. Did your questions bring them back to it in any way? And
I think it slowed them down a little bit but it didn't not. But they may have also been pretty young to have recalled all the detail, and also it was a story that was passed down to them too from their father,
right? Because it was their great uncle.
Yeah, or great uncle and great uncle. Yeah.
Wow.
So stories get changed as they get passed down.
Of course they do.
And then you have
just like that game operator.
Yeah, you have the three sisters telling the story, and they're all different ages, so they may have all heard it differently. They heard it through a different filter, through a different lens, through a different experience. And that's how I often with my siblings, where I probably, and maybe I'll do that, Sarah, recount the story, my recollection of this story to my brothers and sister who were there and see how they remembered it. Because so often we don't remember stories the same way, or we heard them differently. I wonder what my brothers and sister would say.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah. How do they remember that conversation? Because you mentioned that once you said, oh, wait a minute, and started asking questions to try to get a little more detail out of it, that your siblings also suddenly got quiet and wanted to learn more, which I know from a household of Jewish people that's unusual to have everybody stop and be curious about the same thing for a moment.
My sister will argue that she was the one that said stop for a second. My brother will say it was him. we'll all agree that somebody said, hold on, time out, slow the story down, but we'll all remember that we were the one that did it.
Of course, that's how that works. There's a little ego involved. I know, I love it. Wow. Okay, so fast forward to current events. And you obviously, that story obviously is coming back to you for a reason right now. Yeah. And we already talked about the fact that we have work to do. Did something recent, like in the last 6 months or 4 months, happen that that you realized that brought you back to that moment, or that you could really pinpoint as something that you needed to do something different?
Well, I think that, I think with the George Floyd murder, I think all of these incidents that have been getting a lot of visibility because access to video recordings and all that. I think it's awoken me. I mean, that could just have easily been somebody, well, not easily, but somebody could have been holding a video camera watching my great uncle be hung by a Nazi. I'm not going to liken police to Nazis, but
that's how it felt.
That's how it felt. And so, I mean, I think there's been a shift in the world right now. I think where people are getting over their own fragility and beginning to talk about race and being willing to step into the discomfort of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great. And I know that I play a role in that. I'm trying to, I don't want to be that white guy who's competing to be the best non-racist out there. There's a lot of that going on, but just figuring out how to listen better, how to engage my community in conversations around this, how to use my platform and learn more about this system of racism that we all play a part of, and to look at the spectrum that we all exist on in terms of racism. And that to me is, it's important. It feels different. It's, I've always been involved in social causes, but right now it just seems like this has got to become, as Kamala Harris talks about, it's got to be it can't just be a moment. It's got to be a movement. And so I'm committing to using my voice in small ways and big ways.
Yeah, I'm feeling the same way. As a matter of fact, just yesterday I was on the mountain behind my house, and there was a group of young white men that were obviously from here. They were probably in their mid-teens, late teens. And they were on one section of the summit of the mountain. And then another section of the summit, just probably 30 feet away, was a whole family of people that they looked like they may have been, I don't know what their ethnic background was, but it could have been Hmong, or it could have been, I don't know. But I can tell you that I was hearing some different language. And I saw them, it looked like a big family, but also some friends. And I had this moment where I thought, well, I could just walk by and wave and smile. And that's acknowledging that I see them, which I think is really important right now. But then as I thought about these boys behind me, they seemed like nice enough kids. Like they didn't give me any indication they were doing anything wrong or would do anything that was unreasonable or rude to outsiders. at the same time, I wanted to acknowledge and demonstrate to these young men that I love people that are different from me, that I recognize the value of that diversity, and I find it absolutely beautiful. So I turned and I looked at this family and I said, would you like me to take a picture of you all together here at the summit? And they all nodded. Well, not all of them. A couple of them were like, pictures, yuck. But at least 4 of the 6 of them were so happy that I offered to do that. And one of them was going to hand me her phone. And I said, no, I'll use my phone and then I'll airdrop it. Does one of you have an iPhone? That way we don't have to touch each other's phones. And I smiled and she's like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. And she had an accent. So I took a bunch of pictures just to make sure one of them was going to be really good. And I asked them if they lived here or if they were just visiting. And they said, oh, they're visiting from Great Falls, which is just north of Helena. And I said, oh, are you in the military? And they said, yes, most of us are. And I said, well, thank you for your service. And I waved goodbye and I walked away. And, it dawned on me as I walked away why I did that. I didn't intentionally go, oh, well, this will be a good thing to do. It was more this natural instinctive thing. But then as I was walking down the mountain with the dog, I was thinking about what those boys witnessed and how important that is to speak up and do those things to make sure that they know I wouldn't tolerate anything less from them.
Right. I think, and what I'm trying to do is also just notice little microaggressions, not toward me, but toward people of color.
Exactly.
And then figure out how I want to step in, and be a leader in those moments. But I also know that I've got some things to learn, and so I'm somebody with fairly low impulse control. It's like I learn it, I want to do it, I want to practice it right away. So I'm being a little more mindful, taking a little more time to figure out what are the conversations that I can courageously step into, and how to make it safe is the wrong word, but how to make myself comfortable with the discomfort and not set myself up for some horrible thing.
Right.
It's like you have to ask permission in some instances to see if someone is willing to open their mind a little bit in a moment, and some of that is intuition and some of that is actually requesting.
And sometimes you have to ask permission to step in for somebody. I can tell you a woman, particularly a small woman, I'm only 5'2" maximum. And there have been so many times where somebody steps in, trying to be the hero for me. And I'm like, no, I got this.
Exactly.
And by doing that, you just undermined me.
Yeah.
By stepping in like that. So,
right?
Yeah. So I'm really sensitive about that. Like, how do I step in without undermining that person? Right. Because sometimes it feels like, oh, you don't think I could take care of myself?
Exactly.
And that's not okay either.
Right.
So,
but also it could be something that you witness, and after the fact, you can make it a teachable moment. When that it's like, hey, I witnessed this, right? And I want to share with you what I observed, and and then just sort of acknowledge it. Maybe you weren't intending this or that. It just there may have been a different way to have said that, or
to approach it. Yeah.
To approach it, because I feel like that other person walked away feeling like you were X, Y, and Z. And I'm sure that wasn't your intention or whatever. Right. It's like, but it requires that skill of communication and being present to want to engage.
And separating yourself from your own discomfort to provide service for someone else, or to
saying it out loud, I'm getting this knot in my stomach, oh.
I know.
Right.
So this makes me curious. I already know a little bit about you because I've read through your LinkedIn profile, but what you were just saying made me realize that this is exactly your work. This is something that you do generally. So can you give me maybe tell me a story of a client that you worked with that would demonstrate the kind of work that you do?
Which one, right? There's so many.
Right. And every client is different. So
yeah. So really at the foundation of everything I do is work in emotional intelligence and particularly with male leaders in corporations and small business owners to help them understand what emotional intelligence is, where they are not as skilled in it as they could be, how to build that muscle, and how ultimately it will get them greater success as they define it. And so I did have a client working for a major network and a high-level senior executive who's advancing nicely, but he was just getting a lot of feedback from his staff that he lacked empathy and that people felt like they really didn't care about them as human beings. They were human doers, right? They weren't human beings. And even though they were getting the work done, he had high turnover, kind of low feedback scores. And so working with him using EQ, emotional intelligence assessments, helping him with his executive presence and how he was showing up in those conversations, it led him to understand that he needed to lean into those conversations and deal with the emotional part of the relationship in order to build trust, rapport, inspire people. And he did. And over time, he actually found that he was getting even greater results. And it wasn't taking him all that time that he initially thought it would take to deepen a relationship. It was just more the quality of the conversations, not the quantity of them. So that's
right. That's perfect. That describes exactly what I was anticipating hearing. And it's interesting that you say it didn't take as long to deepen those relationships as he anticipated. And I just did an in-person workshop, believe it or not, here in Montana at a state agency, because I'm here in the capital. And we did an active listening exercise. And it was literally 3 minutes that you had to tell a story to the person in front of you and then switch. And so one was practicing the listening, the other was practicing a storytelling. Right. And then they switched. And one woman, we debrief right after the exercise, and she said, I learned so much about him and how he thinks and what motivates him in a 3-minute story. Fantastic. I learned more in those 3 minutes than I've known in the 5 years I've been working with him.
That's great.
So it really is all about just a few minutes at a time of truly hearing somebody. It deepens your relationship.
I'll teach leaders in business how to acknowledge and validate emotions of employees or colleagues or clients, and they'll say to me, "Wow, could I use this at home?"
Yes, please.
Absolutely. Then I get all
use this at home.
Maybe I've saved the marriage too.
Well, I think I saw a post about the difference between therapy and coaching, or counseling and coaching. And one of the things that I keep seeing is that when I'm coaching somebody, you and I, our ultimate goal is really to help people be more self-reflective and shift things based on those self-reflections. So when I can do that, when I'm successful with the client, I know it's going to change their personal lives as well. Yeah. You can't help but change it.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, people may, they may default to old behaviors and old habits, but once you give them the tools, they can always get back to it. So.
Yeah, they practice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Oh my gosh, I love this. So if you were going to share something with a whole bunch of listeners, I have no idea because I don't really look at analytics, but because they're just depressing. No, actually, it's actually pretty good right now. But if you were able to share a message with listeners right now about you and your work and about where you see our roles as humans, and particularly in our efforts to be anti-racist, what would you, as a coach and as a human and as a gay Jewish man, what would you say?
So I feel like I could say anything, but I need to use jazz hands or something. I'm just kidding.
I love you.
But I did work on Broadway, so that would not be a stretch. So I would say that well, there are two related messages. So one is, I think we're experiencing a real crisis in empathy right now in our country, in the U.S., but I think in the world overall. And I think empathy to me is one of the pillars of emotional intelligence, because we are living through such incredibly raw emotional times. I believe that emotional intelligence is going to guide us through to a better and lead us through to a better way. And so that's not to dismiss emotions as unimportant or soft or frivolous, but it's to understand what are the messages that our emotions are giving us, and to understand our triggers and to use those to help us navigate through more productive conversations using the tools of emotional intelligence. So that's my answer.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I believe you're right, that that's what it's going to take. And I think people have to choose it. And I don't know. I think the only way we can do that is if we model it all the time. It has to be consistent. We have to model it all the time. And we have to answer when people ask us those questions. Other than that, we can't change people unless they choose to make adjustments themselves.
Yeah. Well, I'm noticing how triggered I've been getting lately. From Facebook comments to silly to stupidity to maybe stupidity is the wrong word. Ignorance. Ignorance is a better word, right? So I have to really, I can't react off of my triggers. I have to really get underneath them. And when I can do that, then I'm better for it. And the world is a little safer.
Well, and back full circle, as long as you approach it with curiosity and not judgment, whether you're curious about why something triggered you, or whether you are past the curiosity of your internal curiosity about what triggered you and leap into the curiosity about the person in front of you. It's kind of magical when you do that. I notice that it really helps me to separate my emotion from my responses. You ask a question and be truly curious, not a judgmental question like, why would you do that? That doesn't work. Right. That's not a good question.
Right.
I've learned that from asking that of my teenage son. Why would you do that? Right. That's not going to inspire him to answer the question.
That's right. I have to choose very carefully the coaching questions I ask my husband.
Yes.
I'm not leading him down
Yes. I love it. Path. I love it. Alan, this has been such a treat. I've just really enjoyed it.
Such a pleasure.
If our listeners wanted to reach out to you, learn more about you, connect with you, what are the best ways to do that?
Sure. So, and can I offer a gift as well?
Of course, absolutely.
Awesome. So I actually put together a little tip sheet on how to lead through uncertainty. So that's how to lead yourself and others through uncertainty using emotional intelligence. So you can go to bit.ly/ASC leadership, and you can get that download there. But all of my social handles, and it's all Alan Samuel Cohen. My website is alansamuelcohen.com. LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, it's all Alan Samuel Cohen, or alan@alansamuelcohen.com.
All right. Well, and for our listeners, I will have these links in the blog post associated with the podcast, so you don't have to rush over and try to write these things down. And just feel free to click on those links. I love that idea of downloading that. What did you call it about leading through uncertainty?
Leading through uncertainty, yes.
Yes, leading through uncertainty. That is something that I will definitely be downloading and taking advantage of. So thank you for that gift. And for our listeners, I will have a link to connect with Alan on LinkedIn and a few of the other social media platforms that he mentioned. So thanks again, Alan. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You. How You Tell Them Will. If you're planning an event or company retreat and want to bring in a memorable, entertaining, and highly practical speaker as your keynote speaker or workshop facilitator, please visit us at elkinsconsulting.com to learn how we can help and provide a memorable keynote or breakout session. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you.